If someone had told me 10 years ago, or even 10 weeks ago, that my life would be completely upended by a burst pipe in another man's apartment, I would have offered them a cup of tea and a quiet place to lie down. My life was not the kind of life that got upended. It was a meticulously curated collection of straight lines and right angles. My apartment was a testament to this philosophy. Books were arranged by genre, then alphabetically by author. My coffee mugs, all four of them identical, hung from hooks spaced exactly 2 inches apart. My schedule was a fortress, built brick by brick with routine and predictability. I woke at 6:30. I ran 3 miles. I was at my desk by 8:30. I left at 5 on the dot. I was an architect, which felt less like a job and more like a diagnosis. I craved order. I built my life the way I design buildings, with a clear blueprint, strong foundations, and absolutely no room for unexpected weather events. Julian Thorne was an unexpected weather event. He was a force of nature crammed into a suit that always seemed a half size too small across the shoulders. He worked in the acquisitions department, on the floor above mine. We rarely interacted, but his presence was a low-grade tremor in my carefully structured world. He was loud. He laughed from his gut, a booming sound that would occasionally drift down the stairwell. He moved with a kind of restless energy, all broad gestures and confident strides, as if he was constantly on the verge of breaking into a run. He was, to put it mildly, everything I was not. And from the safe, sterile distance of my cubicle, I had developed a crush so profound it was practically a geological feature of my internal landscape. It was a secret, silent mountain range I had to navigate every single day. I observed him the way an astronomer observes a distant, volatile star. I knew the worn spot on the elbow of his gray tweed jacket. I knew he drank his coffee black, from a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Brother." I knew he had a habit of running a hand through his dark, unruly hair when he was stressed, leaving it sticking up in a way that made my fingers ache with the phantom urge to smooth it down. He was, of course, painfully straight. He talked about football on Monday mornings. He was seen leaving with a succession of beautiful, laughing women on Friday evenings. He was a cliché, a walking, talking, breathing stereotype of the kind of man who would never, in a million years, look at someone like me. And that was fine. It was safe. My crush was another object to be cataloged and placed on a shelf. It was a private thing, contained and managed, like the carefully pruned bonsai tree on my windowsill. It required attention, yes, but it would never grow beyond its designated pot. It couldn't. The distance between our worlds was the pot, the container that kept it all manageable. He was on the 4th floor, I was on the 3rd. He was loud, I was quiet. He was a chaotic storm, I was a quiet harbor. The barrier was clear. It was a pane of thick, soundproof glass. I could see him, observe the vibrant, messy life he lived, but I couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel me. It was perfect. It was sustainable. It was lonely. I preferred it that way. Loneliness was a known quantity. It was a quiet ache, a familiar roommate. It didn't slam doors or leave its socks on the floor. It was predictable, safe. Hope, on the other hand, was a demolition crew. I'd learned long ago to keep it boarded up and locked away. So we existed in our separate orbits. For 2 years, this was the status quo. He would occasionally nod at me in the break room, a fleeting, impersonal acknowledgement. "Leo," he'd say, his voice a low rumble that always sent a ridiculous flutter through my chest. "Julian," I'd reply, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. And that would be the extent of it. A universe contained in 2 names, exchanged over the hum of the coffee machine. It was enough. It had to be. The disruption came on a Tuesday. It was raining, a miserable, persistent drizzle that clung to the city like a shroud. I was at my desk, refining the blueprints for a public library, losing myself in the clean, reassuring logic of load-bearing walls and spatial flow. The world outside my monitor, outside the precise lines of my drawing, had ceased to exist. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from our office manager, a woman named Carol who functioned as the central nervous system of the entire company. The message was a mass text to the entire staff. Major flooding at the Kensington apartment building downtown. Several units affected. Julian Thorne from Acquisitions was hit bad. He's looking for a place to crash for a few nights if anyone has a spare room. Let me know. My heart did a strange, painful lurch. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. Julian, hit bad. It felt unreal, like a character from a television show I watched suddenly experiencing a real-world problem. Immediately, my mind went to my spare room. It was a quiet, empty space, a room of ghosts and potential. It held a bed that had never been slept in, a dresser with empty drawers. It was my guest room, though I never had guests. It was my office, though I preferred to work in the living room. It was a monument to my solitude. The thought of Julian, of his chaotic energy and booming laugh and broad shoulders, occupying that silent, ordered space was terrifying. It was like inviting a hurricane to tea. I put the phone down. No, absolutely not. It was a terrible idea. My sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, breached by the one person most likely to knock down all the walls. I imagined his muddy shoes on my pristine hardwood floors, his jacket slung over the back of my dining chair, his voice filling the silence I so carefully cultivated. My stomach twisted into a knot of pure anxiety. But then a different image surfaced. Julian, standing in a flooded apartment, his life soaked and ruined. The man who always seemed so unflappably confident, suddenly without a place to go. The thought was a sharp pang in my chest, a feeling I couldn't ignore. I spent the next hour in a state of agonizing indecision. My finger hovered over Carol's contact information. Don't do it, Leo. It's not your problem. You're not his friend. You're just a quiet guy from downstairs. But the image of his distress wouldn't leave me. It was a splinter under my skin. At 4:50, 10 minutes before I was scheduled to leave, I saw him. He was standing near the elevators, talking on his phone. He looked diminished. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. His hair was damp and flat from the rain, and he scrubbed a hand over his face in a gesture of pure exhaustion. He wasn't a distant star anymore. He was just a man who had had a very bad day. My carefully constructed walls, the ones I had spent years reinforcing, suddenly felt thin as paper. Before I could second-guess myself, before my rational brain could scream at me to turn around and walk away, I found myself moving. My legs carried me towards him as if they had a mind of their own. He ended his call as I approached, his eyes looking tired and unfocused. He saw me, and a flicker of recognition, maybe surprise, crossed his face. "Leo," he said. His voice was rough. "Julian," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. "Say it. Just say it." I heard about your apartment." I managed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, it's a swimming pool now. Apparently the guy upstairs left his tub running for about 6 hours." He sighed, the sound heavy with defeat. "Everything's ruined." The silence stretched between us, thick and awkward. My mind was a blank slate. All my carefully prepared internal monologues, all my witty observations, had vanished. "I have a spare room," I heard myself say. The words hung in the air. I felt like I had just jumped off a cliff without checking to see if there was water below. Julian blinked. He stared at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in 2 years. His gaze was intense, searching. I felt pinned, exposed. He was seeing past the quiet architect, the nodding acquaintance. He was seeing me. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was tight. He continued to stare for a long moment, and a strange expression flickered in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something I couldn't decipher. I don't want to impose, man. It's no imposition," I said, finding my voice again. "It's empty. Just collecting dust like the rest of my life," a traitorous part of my brain added. He blew out a long breath, and it was like watching a string being cut. The tension visibly drained from his shoulders. "Wow. Okay. Yeah. Leo, that would be amazing. Thank you." Seriously. And just like that, the hurricane was invited in. The blueprints for my life were set on fire. The carefully maintained distance between our worlds collapsed into nothing. He was no longer a star in a distant galaxy. He was a man with a duffel bag, and he was coming home with me. That first night was an exercise in surreal tension. The drive to my apartment was mostly silent, filled only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine. Julian stared out the passenger window, his reflection a ghostly overlay on the rain-streaked city lights. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my mind racing. What have I done? This is a mistake. A colossal, Category 5 mistake. When we walked into my apartment, the silence of the space seemed to rush out to meet us. It was a physical thing, a presence I had cultivated, and Julian's arrival shattered it. The sound of his damp boots on the welcome mat, the rustle of his jacket as he took it off, the quiet thud of his duffel bag hitting the floor. Each noise was an intrusion, a foreign element in my sterile environment. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking around. He was so big. My carefully arranged furniture seemed to shrink in his presence. He dwarfed the armchair, made the coffee table look like a child's toy. His presence changed the very air in the room, charging it with a nervous energy that made my skin prickle. "Wow," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet. "This is neat." I knew what he meant. He meant it was sterile. He meant it was like a showroom, a place where no one actually lived. I felt a flush of defensiveness, of embarrassment. "I like things organized," I said, the statement sounding lame even to my own ears. He just nodded, his eyes scanning my bookshelves. "Yeah, I can see that." He ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture of distress. "Look, man, I really appreciate this." I was about to book a motel room that probably rents by the hour. "It's fine," I said quickly. "Let me show you the room." I led him down the short hallway to the spare room. The door opened with a faint creak. The room was just as I'd left it. A bed with a plain gray comforter, an empty desk, a bare window looking out onto the brick wall of the next building. It was the physical embodiment of my emotional life. Julian dropped his bag on the floor. "This is perfect. More than perfect." He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw the true extent of his exhaustion. There were dark circles under his eyes, and new lines of strain etched around his mouth. The confident, boisterous man from the office was gone. In his place was someone vulnerable, someone worn down to the bone. My carefully guarded heart gave a painful twist. "The bathroom is just across the hall," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "There are clean towels in the closet." "Thanks, Leo." He gave me a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I think I'm just going to crash. It's been a hell of a day, yeah." Of course, I retreated to my own room, closing the door behind me. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud. I stood in the dark, listening. I could hear him moving around in the other room, the muffled sounds of him unpacking the few things he'd managed to salvage. The floorboards creaked under his weight. The shower turned on, a rush of water that filled the silence. He was here, in my home, a few feet away. The reality of it settled over me like a heavy blanket. My fortress had been breached. The quiet solitude I had clung to for so long was gone, replaced by the undeniable presence of another person. A person I'd spent 2 years secretly, hopelessly, wanting. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sound of someone else breathing in my apartment. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Sleep felt like a distant country I had no visa for. This was the thaw. I didn't know it then, but the ice around my life was beginning to crack. The next few days passed in a strange, blurry haze of forced domesticity. I began to see Julian not as the caricature I had built in my mind, but as a person. A messy, complicated, surprisingly quiet person. He was a ghost in the mornings. I would wake at my usual 6:30, and he would already be gone, leaving behind only a damp towel on the bathroom floor and the lingering scent of his soap, something clean and sharp like sandalwood and rain. The first time I saw the towel, a small mountain of terry cloth in a heap, my inner drill sergeant of neatness screamed in protest. I almost picked it up, but I stopped myself. This was a space now, too. A small concession, a tiny crack in my rigid foundation. In the evenings, he would return late, looking drained from long, frustrating calls with his insurance company and landlord. We would exist in the same space, separated by a chasm of unspoken things. He would sit on one end of the sofa, scrolling through his phone, while I sat on the other, pretending to read a book, the words on the page meaningless squiggles. The silence was different now. It was no longer the peaceful, empty silence of my solitude. It was a living thing, heavy and charged. It was filled with the sound of his sighs, the tap of his fingers on his phone screen, the quiet rhythm of his breathing. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a stage, and I had forgotten all my lines. It was during those quiet evenings that I started to truly observe him, not as the object of a distant crush, but as a man sharing my home. I saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he read an email. I noticed a small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that made his face suddenly more real, more human. I saw the calluses on his hands, the hands I had only ever seen holding a coffee mug or a pen. They were the hands of someone who did more than just push papers. One evening, he was on the phone, his voice low and tight with frustration. "No, I understand that, but the policy clearly states." "Look, I can't. Just listen to me for 1 second." He finally hung up with a frustrated groan, dropping his head into his hands. He looked up and saw me watching. A flush crept up his neck. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Insurance people. They're vampires, it's okay," I said. It was the first real conversation we'd had in days. He scrubbed his face with his hands. "They're saying it could be weeks, maybe a month, before the apartment is livable again." He looked at me, his expression clouded with apology. "Leo, I can't stay here that long. I'll find somewhere else. A corporate rental or something. Don't be ridiculous," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Where would you go?" "Stay." "It's fine. Why did I say that?" Every instinct for self-preservation was screaming at me to let him go, to reclaim my quiet, ordered life. But the sight of his weariness, the genuine vulnerability in his eyes, overrode everything. It was like finding a stray dog on your doorstep. You know you shouldn't let it in, but you do anyway. He looked at me a long, searching gaze. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "I'm sure a month." The word echoed in the space between us. A month of this quiet tension, of this proximity that was both thrilling and agonizing. A month of sharing my space with the one person who could demolish it completely. The first touch happened on a Saturday. It was as insignificant as it was monumental. We were in the kitchen, a space far too small for two people, especially when one of them was Julian. I was making coffee, a ritual I performed with near-religious precision. He was trying to get a bowl from the cupboard above the coffee maker. We moved at the same time. He reached up, his arm brushing against mine. I reached for the coffee pot. Our hands collided. It wasn't a graze. It was a solid, definite contact. His fingers, warm and calloused, pressed against the back of my hand. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. It was like grabbing a live wire. Every nerve ending in my body screamed to attention. The air was sucked out of my lungs. For a single, eternal second, the world stopped. There was only the heat of his skin against mine, the rough texture of his calluses, the sudden, shocking intimacy of it. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, panicked drumbeat. I could feel the blood rushing to my face. "Sorry," he mumbled, pulling a bowl from the cupboard, seemingly unaffected. "It's fine," I choked out, turning away so he couldn't see the ridiculous blush I knew was staining my cheeks. But it wasn't fine. The spot on my hand where he had touched me tingled, a phantom warmth that lingered for the rest of the day. The brief, accidental contact had breached a new wall. It had transformed the theoretical into the physical. He wasn't just a presence in my apartment anymore. He was a body, a source of heat and texture and electricity. The carefully maintained distance I kept, even while living with him, had been obliterated by 5 seconds of contact in the kitchen. The dynamic between us began to shift after that, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The silence became less tense and more comfortable. We started talking more. Small things at first. We discovered a shared, nerdy love for old science fiction films. We argued about whether Die Hard was a Christmas movie. He told me about his family, about the younger brother his coffee mug referred to. I found myself, to my own astonishment, telling him about my dream of designing a house for myself one day, a quiet place in the woods. He listened. He actually listened, his head tilted, his gaze focused. He didn't interrupt or look at his phone. He made me feel seen. It was a terrifying and exhilarating sensation. The real shift, the leveling of the field, came a week later. I came home from work to find the apartment eerily quiet. Julian's shoes were by the door, but there was no sign of him. I found him in his room, lying in bed, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Hey," I said from the doorway. "You okay?" He turned his head slowly. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. "Not really," he rasped, his voice a wreck. "Think I've got the flu." And just like that, the powerful, confident Julian Thorne was gone. In his place was a sick, miserable man, shivering under a thin comforter. The balance of power, which had always been so heavily skewed in his favor, suddenly tilted. He was the one who was vulnerable. I was the one who was in charge. I spent the next 3 days taking care of him. I made him soup, which he ate with surprising gratitude. I went to the pharmacy and bought medicine, which I had to bully him into taking. I brought him glass after glass of water and listened to him complain in a fever-induced haze. I saw him without his armor. I saw him weak and needy and completely at my mercy. And instead of feeling powerful, I just felt a deep, protective ache in my chest. This was the man behind the booming laugh and the confident swagger. A man who, when stripped of his defenses, was just as vulnerable as anyone else. On the third night, his fever finally broke. I was sitting in a chair in his room, reading, the only light coming from a small lamp on the desk. He had been asleep for hours. Suddenly, he stirred. "Leo," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm here," I said softly. He blinked, trying to focus on me. "You didn't have to stay, I wanted to," I said. And it was true. I hadn't wanted to leave his side. He was quiet for a long moment. "No one's taken care of me like this since I was a kid," he said, his voice low and raw. "My mom used to make me toast. The confession was so simple, so unexpected, it knocked the wind out of me. It was a glimpse into a loneliness I hadn't known he carried. The strong, independent Julian Thorne missed his mom making him toast. "I can make you toast in the morning," I offered, my voice unsteady. A small smile touched his lips. "I'd like that," he whispered, and then his eyes drifted shut again. I sat there in the quiet room, the lamplight pooling around me, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something fundamental had changed. The ice hadn't just cracked, it had melted, and I was adrift in a new and uncharted ocean with no land in sight. I was completely, irrevocably in over my head. The turning point arrived with a thunderstorm. It rolled in on a Thursday night, a week after his flu, tearing the sky apart with cinematic fury. The power went out just after 10, plunging my apartment into sudden, absolute darkness. My breath hitched. The silence that followed the hum of the dying appliances was profound. "Well, crap," Julian's voice came from the living room, a low rumble in the dark. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding beacon. "I have candles," I said, my voice sounding shaky. I navigated my way to the kitchen, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against the storm's percussion. We lit them together. 3 fat vanilla candles on the coffee table. The small flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The apartment, usually so defined by its sharp lines and clean surfaces, was transformed. It became a cave, a small, intimate shelter against the raging world outside. The light was soft and golden, blurring the edges of everything, making the space feel smaller, warmer. We sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, watching the rain lash against the windows. The storm provided the soundtrack, a symphony of roaring thunder and drumming rain. There was no television, no phones, no distractions. There was only the darkness, the candlelight, and us. "I used to love storms like this when I was a kid," he said, his voice quiet, reflective. "I'd build a fort out of blankets in the living room and pretend I was on a spaceship flying through an asteroid field." I smiled, the image so vivid and so perfectly Julian. I used to hide under my bed. He turned to look at me, his face half in shadow, half in golden light. His eyes seemed darker, deeper in the flickering gloom. "Yeah," he said softly. I can see that it wasn't an insult. It was just a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of our differences. He was the fort builder. I was the hider. We fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence now. A shared silence. The space between us no longer felt like a chasm, but like a gentle current pulling us closer. I was acutely aware of him, of the warmth radiating from his body just a foot away from mine. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap, mixed with the vanilla from the candles. He started his voice so low I almost didn't hear him over a clap of thunder. He didn't look at me. He stared into the flame of the nearest candle. "This has been weird," my stomach clenched. "Here it comes. I need to find another place" speech. "Weird how?" I asked, bracing myself. "Living here," he said. He finally turned his head, his gaze meeting mine. The candlelight caught in his eyes, making them gleam. "It's so quiet, so calm. My life is never calm. It just go, go, go. Work, gym, friends, noise. Always noise." He paused, searching for the right words. "Being here, with you, it's the quietest my head has been in years." The confession hung in the air between us, as charged and electric as the storm outside. It was more intimate than his admission about his mother, more revealing than anything he had ever said to me. He wasn't just talking about my apartment. He was talking about me. My quiet, my order, the very things I always thought made me boring and invisible were things he found peace in. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. My carefully constructed defenses were crumbling, turning to dust under the weight of his words. "I never thought," he started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I now recognized as a sign of his own uncertainty. He looked lost, confused. "I don't know what I'm trying to say." And in that moment, seeing his confusion, his vulnerability, a reckless bravery bloomed in my chest. It was a tiny, fragile flower pushing its way through concrete. "I know," I whispered, and I did. I knew the feeling of a life that was too loud, of a heart that was too quiet. He looked at me, and the world seemed to slow down. The storm outside faded to a distant murmur. The dancing shadows on the wall stilled. It felt like the universe was holding its breath. His eyes searched my face, and I didn't hide. For the first time, I let him see everything. The longing, the fear, the ridiculous, hopeless affection I had harbored for 2 years. He shifted, moving closer. The space between us shrank from a foot to inches. I could feel the heat of his leg next to mine. My breathing hitched. "This is it. This is happening." He raised a hand, slowly, hesitantly, as if giving me time to pull away. I didn't move. I couldn't. His fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, a question. I leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement. It was all the answer he needed. He closed the remaining distance between us. His lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was slow. It was hesitant and questioning. It was unbelievably gentle. It was a search, a discovery. His lips were soft, tasting faintly of the coffee he'd had hours earlier. He wasn't demanding anything. He was asking, "Is this okay?" I answered by kissing him back, my own fear and uncertainty melting away into a feeling of pure, unadulterated rightness. All the years of silent pining, of distant observation, of carefully managed feelings, they all collapsed into this one perfect moment. This was real. He was real, and he was kissing me. He deepened the kiss slightly, and his other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my skin. A soft sound escaped my throat, a sigh of surrender and relief. It felt like coming home to a place I had never known existed. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We didn't speak. We just looked at each other in the flickering candlelight, the air thick with everything that had just happened. His thumb continued to stroke my cheek, a small, grounding gesture in a world that had just been tilted on its axis. In his eyes, I didn't see arrogance or confidence. I saw the same wonder, the same fear, the same fragile hope that was blooming in my own chest. The strong, silent man from Acquisitions, the one I thought I had all figured out, was just as lost in this as I was. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel alone in the storm. The morning after was a brutal re-entry into reality. I woke slowly, my mind fuzzy with sleep and a lingering memory of candlelight and soft kisses. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I felt a warmth, a deep-seated contentment I hadn't known was possible. Then I opened my eyes. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, slicing the room into bars of light and shadow. I was in my own bed, alone. The apartment was silent. Too silent. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, chasing away the warmth. I got up, my heart starting a low, anxious thrum. I pulled on a t-shirt and went into the living room. It was empty. The candles from a night before sat on the coffee table, their wicks cold and black. The room looked stark and clinical in the morning light, all its soft, magical edges gone. I checked his room. The door was open. The bed was made, or rather, the comforter was pulled up hastily. His duffel bag was still there, but he was gone. A glance at the clock told me it was 7:30. He was never gone this early. My stomach plummeted, a sickening, free-falling sensation. He left. He left without a word. Without a look. He ran. The spiral started instantly. A vortex of doubt and self-recrimination. It was a mistake. A huge, catastrophic mistake. He was confused. He was lonely. The storm, the darkness, it was just a moment of weakness, a fluke. And in the harsh light of morning, he had realized his error and fled. My own foolishness was a bitter taste in my mouth. How could I have let that happen? How could I have been so stupid as to believe it meant something? I was a port in a storm, a temporary convenience. And now the storm had passed. I went through the motions of my morning routine, but everything felt wrong. The coffee tasted like ash. The silence of the apartment, once a comfort, was now a screaming accusation. It was the silence of absence, the silence of rejection. Every empty space seemed to echo with his departure. I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, searching for clues I had missed. Was it pity? Was it an experiment? My mind, my greatest analytical tool as an architect, became an instrument of torture, drafting blueprint after blueprint of my own humiliation. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a punishment. It was tainted. Before Julian, the quiet of my apartment was a choice. It was peace. Now it was just empty. It was the sound of a door closing. The day at work was hell. I sat at my desk, staring at the same blueprint for 8 hours, unable to focus. Every time I heard footsteps approaching my cubicle, my heart would leap into my throat, a frantic bird, only to plummet when it was someone else. I didn't see him. Not once. I didn't know if he was even in the building. The not knowing was worse than anything. I left at 5 on the dot, my stomach a knot of bees. The walk to my car, the drive home, it was all a blur of anxiety. What would I find when I got back? Would his bag be gone? Would there be a note on the counter? Thanks for everything. Sorry about last night, the thought made me physically ill. I let myself into the apartment, my hand trembling so badly it took 2 tries to get the key in the lock. I stepped inside, holding my breath. It was just as I had left it. Silent. Empty. His bag was still in the spare room. A small, temporary reprieve. But the silence stretched on. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 7. With every passing minute, my anxiety grew, hardening into a miserable certainty. He wasn't coming back. He was at a friend's place. He was at a hotel. He was anywhere but here. He couldn't face me. I felt hollowed out, a building gutted by fire. The hope that had bloomed in my chest the night before was now a pile of smoking rubble. I had allowed the hurricane in, and it had done exactly what I had feared. It had leveled everything, leaving me standing alone in the wreckage. The old, familiar loneliness settled back over me, but it was different now. It was heavier. It was no longer a quiet roommate, but a cruel ghost, whispering all the things I had always believed about myself. That I was unlovable, that I was destined to be alone, that I had been a fool to want anything more. I went to bed at 9, unable to bear the weight of the silence any longer. I curled up under the covers, the sheets cold against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. The period of silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an absence of him, an absence of hope. And it was the most deafening noise I had ever heard. The next day was a repeat of the first, a torturous loop of silence, anxiety, and the crushing weight of his absence. He didn't come home that night either. His side of the bathroom counter remained empty. His towel remained dry. His room remained a perfect, undisturbed vacuum. I started to accept it. The new, painful reality. It had been a blip, a weird, inexplicable moment that I had catastrophically misinterpreted. He would probably send a friend to pick up his bag. We would go back to being strangers who nodded in the break room. Except now, it would be tainted with a thick, unbearable awkwardness for the rest of our professional lives. The thought was mortifying. On the third evening of the Great Silence, I decided I couldn't live in limbo anymore. I couldn't live with his ghost in my apartment. I went into his room, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, and I started to pack his things. I folded his few shirts and placed them carefully in his duffel bag. It felt like a funeral. I was packing away the last 2 weeks, packing away the brief, fragile hope he had given me. I was zipping up the bag when I heard a key in the lock. I froze. My entire body went rigid. It couldn't be. The door opened and then closed. Footsteps, heavy and hesitant, came down the hall. Julian appeared in the doorway of the spare room. He looked terrible, worse than when he had the flu. His eyes were bloodshot, shadowed with exhaustion. He hadn't shaved. He was still wearing the clothes he'd had on 2 days ago, now rumpled and sad. He looked like he had been through a war. He saw me. He saw the bag in my hand. His face crumpled. "Leo," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. "What you doing?" I figured you weren't coming back," I said, my own voice thin and brittle. "I was just getting your things together. You can pick them up whenever." I couldn't look at him. I stared at a point on the wall, just over his shoulder. "Not coming back?" he repeated, his voice filled with a pained disbelief. "Why would you think that?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Oh, I don't know, Julian. Maybe because you disappeared for 2 days without a word after you kissed me?" The words were sharper than I intended, laced with all the hurt and humiliation of the past 48 hours. He flinched as if I had physically struck him. He took a step into the room, then another. He looked utterly wrecked. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I'm an idiot, you ran," I said, the accusation flat and heavy. "Yes," he admitted, his gaze falling to the floor. "I ran." I panicked. He looked back up at me, his eyes pleading. "But I wasn't running from you." I just stared at him, my confusion warring with my hurt. "I was running from this," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "From how I felt. I don't know what this is. When I kissed you, it was like a light switch flipped on in a room I didn't even know existed. And it terrified me." He took another step closer. "I've spent my whole life being what everyone expected me to be. The loud guy, the confident guy, the guy who dates women and talks about football. And then you, this quiet, steady person who saw something else. And that night, I felt something I have never felt for anyone, man or woman. And it scared the hell out of me." He was standing right in front of me now. I could see the genuine anguish in his eyes. This wasn't an act. This was a man laid bare. "I stayed at my brother's place," he continued, his voice cracking. "I just sat on his couch for 2 days, trying to get my head straight, trying to figure out what it all meant. And the only thing I figured out is that the thought of never seeing you again, of going back to just nodding at you in the break room, it was worse than any confusion. It was unbearable." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between us. "I know I messed up. I hurt you. But please, Leo, don't pack that bag." The clarifying conversation. It wasn't an argument. It was a surrender, a mutual confession of fear. All my anger, all my hurt, it just dissolved, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared and lost as I was. I let go of the duffel bag. It fell to the floor with a soft thud. I thought I imagined it. I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He finally closed the distance, his hand finding mine, his fingers lacing with my own. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm. It was the first real thing that's happened to me in a very long time. He lifted my hand and held it against his chest. I could feel his heart beating, a frantic, unsteady rhythm that matched my own. We just stood there for a long time, in the middle of the quiet room, holding on to each other as if we were the only two people left in the world. The silence was finally broken, and in its place, something new and fragile and terrifyingly real began to grow. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Not my coffee, not the precisely measured, pour-over brew I made every day. This was a different smell, richer, bolder. I found Julian in the kitchen. He was standing by the counter, shirtless, wearing a pair of gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips. He was using my French press, something I hadn't touched in years. He had two mugs out on the counter, my plain white one, and his ridiculous world's okayest brother mug, which he must have salvaged from his apartment. He looked up when I entered, and a slow, hesitant smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, my voice a little husky. There was no awkwardness. The crushing tension from before was gone, replaced by a shy, tentative warmth. It was a new beginning, a fragile dawn. He poured the coffee. "I hope this is okay. I'm a French press guy. It's perfect," I said. He handed me my mug, and our fingers brushed. This time, neither of us pulled away. The jolt was still there, but it wasn't panic anymore. It was a promise, a connection. Later that day, a Saturday, he started to unpack. Not his duffel bag. He had gone to his flooded apartment with his brother and returned with 3 large cardboard boxes filled with the things that had survived. Books, a few pieces of art, clothes that had been high up in his closet. He started taking books out of a box and looking at my bookshelf. "You mind if I?" he asked, holding up a worn copy of a sci-fi novel we had talked about. "No," I said, my heart doing a little flip. "Not at all." He began to slide his books onto my shelves. His worn paperbacks nestled in between my pristine hardcovers. His chaotic collection disrupted my careful alphabetical order, and I found that I didn't mind. It looked right. It looked like a life was actually being lived here. He put a framed photo on the end table next to the sofa. It was him and a smiling young man who was clearly his brother. His life, his history, was slowly, carefully integrating with mine. He wasn't a guest anymore. The symbolic gesture, the one that solidified everything, came that afternoon. He came back from a short trip to the hardware store. He walked up to me, a strange, nervous energy about him. "Here," he said, holding out his hand. Lying in his palm was a key, a freshly cut, gleaming silver key, a key to my apartment. I stared at it. I figured, if I'm going to be living here. He started, his voice a little shaky. "I should have one of these." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a tangible act of commitment. He wasn't asking to stay. He was staying. He was choosing to build something here with me. In the wreckage of his old life, he was laying a new foundation. I took the key from his hand. It was cool and solid against my skin. It felt heavier than it should. It felt like the weight of a future I had never dared to imagine. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight. He just smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made the exhaustion fall away from his face. And in that moment, I knew. This was it. The new beginning. The storm was over. The floodwaters were receding, and something beautiful and unexpected was starting to grow in the quiet aftermath. My meticulously designed life was in ruins, and I had never been happier. Life settled into a new rhythm, a shared rhythm. My solitary routines were replaced by domestic intimacies that felt both shockingly new and deeply familiar. Mornings were no longer silent. They were filled with the sound of 2 coffee makers working in tandem, his French press, my pour-over. We would sit at my small dining table, which now felt perfectly sized, and read the news on our phones in a comfortable, companionable silence. His ridiculous mug sat next to my plain one, a permanent fixture on the drying rack. My pristine apartment started to show signs of life. His jacket was perpetually slung over the back of a chair. A pair of his running shoes lived by the door. My bookshelf was a happy, chaotic mix of his dog-eared sci-fi and my architectural theory. It was no longer just my space. It was ours. And every small disruption of my old order was a welcome reminder that I was no longer alone. Evenings were the best. We would cook dinner together in the small kitchen, bumping into each other, laughing. We would collapse onto the sofa, my legs often thrown over his, and watch old movies. The space between us on the couch, once a gaping chasm of anxiety, was now non-existent. There was always a point of contact, a hand on a knee, our shoulders pressed together, his arm draped casually around me. Each touch was a quiet reassurance, a grounding force. Sleeping was the biggest change. We started in our separate rooms, but after a few nights of feeling the pull of his presence through the wall, he appeared in my doorway. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with a question in his eyes. I moved over, and he slid into bed beside me. Sharing a bed with him was a revelation. There was no anxiety, no fear of rejection. There was just the solid, warm weight of his body next to mine. The sound of his steady breathing in the dark was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I would fall asleep to that sound every night, feeling safer and more at peace than I had ever felt in my life. I look back now at the man I was before the flood, the solitary, observant man who lived his life behind thick, soundproof glass. He built walls to keep the world out, to keep himself safe from the messy, unpredictable nature of human connection. He mistook solitude for peace and order for happiness. Julian wasn't just a plot twist in my quiet, predictable story. He was a demolition crew. He came into my life with the force of a natural disaster and wrecked all my careful plans. He knocked down my walls, flooded my quiet routines, and left chaos in his wake. And in the ruins, we built something new, something stronger and more beautiful than I could have ever designed on my own. He didn't just move into my apartment. He moved into the quiet, empty spaces in my life and filled them with his warmth, his laughter, and his surprisingly gentle heart. He taught me that a home isn't about straight lines and perfect order. It's about shared spaces and messy bookshelves and having two different kinds of coffee makers on the counter. It's about the person you wait for at the end of the day. My life is no longer a fortress. It's an open door. And every morning when I wake up with his arm around me, I'm so incredibly grateful for that burst pipe, for that rainy Tuesday, for the unexpected weather event that changed everything. He was the disruption that led me to a truer sense of myself, and to a love I never thought I was brave enough to find. He didn't just teach me how to live without walls. He became my home.